Hey, DeRacers. So today, really excited to have G from SMR on today to talk about stats. He is one of my favorite people in the community. We've shared resources, we've collaborated for months now. He was the one that gave us insight to the three phases, especially the 15 rolls and the 30% in the end, which was a major shift in the way we've analyzed things. So among other people that have collaborated with us, really appreciate everybody that messages me, shares your research, shares your notes. This is just a really fun conversation. Now, Mr. E and I, we debate and argue about stats and analytics all the time. So we're just really excited to bring somebody else into the conversation so that way you can see what this kind of conversation is like. None of this is necessarily 100% factual. A lot of this is just research and where we're just going from and what we think is the best approaches. So
I'm gonna listen to Not a Vampire and OxG debate over things that are not necessarily factual. So I'll be emceeing that and going through a series of questions here. But before anything else, why don't we go ahead and bring in G?
here we go. Welcome.
Hey guys, great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for
Thanks
joining
for
us.
coming on. Yeah.
Super early for you, of course.
Yeah,
All right.
but I love the fact that we're going to be debating things that aren't factual. I do my best work when there are no facts supporting it.
When you can just wing it as you go, that's the best stuff. I mean, some of our best ideas come out of throwing something at the dartboard and seeing what ends up sticking. I know we talk about being able to look at the same data in a thousand different ways. So this conversation is probably going to have a lot of that, where we're talking about similar things, but ultimately looking at it slightly differently.
And before we dive into anything, I want to make sure there's a reminder to everybody. So G is the guy that was putting together the new API calls for all the tools that we've been building. So he's stabilized everything. It should be working really well. Now, when we were doing that, there was an old call that was built in, but now there's some new calls. So if you have not yet updated, if you have your own tools, make sure to take the description down below, get the updated API access so you could put that into your tools. So you use the appropriate ones. Or if you're using an outdated version of our public tool, make sure to get an update so that way it's running smoothly for you. All right.
All right. Well, we're going to deep dive into a handful of topics here. We're going to touch on, studying your horse. Obviously, that's why we're here, trying to find as much data as we can about every horse while not getting lost in all of the data at the same time. We're going to be talking about a little bit about breeding and recommendations regarding that, and what to look for in a horse when you're out on the market. And we'll probably wrap this all up talking a little bit about stamina and some of the details and data that is still fuzzy for a lot of people. So we'll wrap that up. But we're going to start right off the bat with asking the question, if I'm brand new or I have a brand new horse, how would you recommend that I limit the race count that I have to do? I do not want to end up spending hundreds and hundreds of Dirk trying to discover what my horse is good at. What do both of you say? Is there any way that I can limit that time in discovery?
I'll let you start with this one, G.
Yeah, okay, cool. Firstly, the question is how many. Okay, if you go brute force, always an option. You can take the 30, the 30 races per length and per surface. But let's just assume for the moment that you don't want to do that. I also am not sure that 30 is actually required. I think, personally, I've always been starting with 10. So I start at 10 and actually, I call that sort of we call it a level 1 assessment. So, you're at the first level of what you're actually trying to achieve. It's still brute force. It's not good enough. You want to actually shortcut that as much as possible. So we really, look at the tools and look at the stats in your tools are, a good way to actually start. So really looking at the reaction time. So reaction time consistent across the surfaces, or pretty consistent across the surfaces. So again, really short, really low reaction time. We know reaction time goes from 150 to 800. That's the span. Okay. So if you're getting anything in that, I would have said sort of 3 to 400 and below, that, again, you got a possibility across every single race. But if you're seeing reaction times as I have with some of my horses of the 600s and 700s, forget anything under about six furlongs. Just not worth it. So you really want to be pushing up and actually focusing on the 11 and higher is kind of where my mind goes, or at least this is the top 50%. That can cut your spend in half. Think of it that way. If
Mhm.
you know you've got a bad reaction time, you've cut it in half automatically. Then you start actually looking at, and trying to figure out whether or not, which races are then actually good. And we know, you start thinking about how the horses are constructed. Don't think about it from a nature perspective. Think about it from a game designer perspective. Each of these horses has attributes. You've got to figure out sort of, look for those attributes and actually how they turn up. So speed, again, I start to look at speed, and does the speed, what's the average furlong for a horse in particular phases of its journey, of the actual race. So we look at that. I look at between the 15 rolls and the 70% roll mark. So what is what's its average there? And if it's got a good average there, that it's, well, it could be good everywhere. But again, how much of the race is stamina? Because so how many rolls does stamina impact? Because if stamina really is a real a real differentiator, what we actually want to do is we want to find the races where stamina has the most impact on the horse, and then actually again bring it back to that. So the problem with having a potentially good horse is you're going to probably have to run it everywhere, because it's going to have great stats everywhere. But if you don't have a good horse, and I've had a number of them, then you want to limit it as fast as possible. So I start to look at how do I find bad stats? How do I find it where the speed is low, or the stamina just doesn't hold up over a number of runs?
Yeah,
Agreed.
very good.
So
How about you, Vampire?
yeah, so what I would recommend is similar to what you were just talking about on that one. Initially, what I used to say, you need to hit 10 everywhere. And when I did that with my donkeys, I just lost 100 to 200 dirk before I was just frustrated. And that's just not a good strategy if you're new. What I've recently been experimenting with, and so I'll probably, well, I know I'll be continuing my research on this, is I want to start with fives. So fives is the first place that I would go through. So that way you do dirts, you do your synth, and you do your turfs. And when you do that, you're immediately going to know your reaction, because like you said, your reaction is going to be relatively consistent between the three. So when you're doing the fives and you have a bad reaction, you have at least enough time to catch up to that. So you're not just losing to all the sprinters. Fives will give you that baseline. And then from there, I would recommend 15 to 20 on each, I think. And then once you have your fives done, you're going to be able to determine really quickly, where do you show up? Is it on synth? Is it on dirt? Or is it on turf? You'll know your reaction. If your reaction is fast, then what I would do is I would switch to twos. So even if you're a turf horse, I wouldn't worry about it. I would switch over to your dirt twos and your synth twos, and then I would like to figure out that angle. So I could try to figure out, again, linear regression, which I'll probably talk about a lot today. If you find out that your horse is slow, I would skip your dirts altogether, and I'd probably jump to tens. So that way you have a nice split from either 2 to 5, or you have from 5 to 10 on either of those. And the goal that I would have is to figure out, where do you have the best chance of finding a track that's going to be profitable. And then once you discover a range, an area, you shouldn't have to put too much into it. But once you start making a profit and you find that, I highly recommend that you do scattershot and you fill in all those voids, because I continue to train Skondert with over 3,000 races, and I'm still surprised by what I'm learning from that horse. So I think training is a long, long process. And unfortunately, way too many people will say, after 20 races, my horse has changed, or it's no longer good at this. And it's like, no way, man. I have 50 hits on a specific track, and I'm still hitting it because I think it's going to change. So I think that you just need to start a little bit more strategically, move around. But yeah, look for some indicators that way.
So let me pose this to both of you again. A little bit of the question of, let's say I've been following some of that advice and I'm just kind of break even. I'm not really making money, not really losing too much money. How far do you go before you say that this horse is worth hanging on to, or this horse is worth turning into sugar at some point?
I was going to say, can I just jump in? Because if you're at the point of breaking even, you're doing well. Let's be real. Yeah. So looking at the stats and looking at the number of the horses that are not actually making money. The last stat I ran, I think it was somewhere like 74% of horses were not making money. So you just want to just be realistic and go, if I'm breaking even, I'm okay, because I've still got money in the tank to actually to continue to evaluate. And and with as Not a Vampire said, we're at the point where we're still learning after every track, after every race. You can still start to hit things. I'm hitting races with my horse that I did not expect to do well, and all of a sudden I'm doing really well. So don't don't think that just breaking even is not good right now. It gives you the
Agreed.
ability to still grow from there.
Agreed.
One thing I'd add to that before Not a
Yeah.
Vampire speaks there real quick is I would just recommend that, if you do get tired of testing a horse, feel free to set it aside for a bit, especially if you have a second or third horse that you want to focus on, because like G said, you may come back to it and find that there's a track that suddenly has opened up. We've seen the averages around the racetrack on different horses change over time. It will get faster or slower, and you may find that your horse dips into that fringe where it can make a little more money for a period of time. It may also be in a good cycle, and that's something else that you may want to consider coming back to.
We're going to have sorry, man.
Yeah,
We're going to
go
have
for
weather
it.
at some point. We're going to have weather at some point. You don't know whether your horse is going to be, a great performer in the wet. Like, there are so many things you don't know yet. So don't give up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, if you have a donkey, give up. But the other thing, if you have a fringe horse, what you don't have yet is we don't have 2, 3s, 4s on turf, and we don't have above 7s on dirt. So when I had my Scondert, everybody knows I have Scondert, but I only had dirt, and he was losing me money, and it was very, very frustrating. When Synth came out, I was hopeful. He did decent on a couple tracks, but then turf showed up, and then he made me money. I was not profitable until turf showed up, and it took me a long time of burying into the hole where it was an annoying game for me because I put a lot of money into that horse and I just kept losing. So if you have a horse that's close to break even, yeah, you might not be in a good place, but the moment we have tiered races and you have some of these champions pull away from some of the fringe, I think you're going to start to get your money back. And so I would not burn that horse. I don't know if I would even sell that horse. I might hold on to that and wait, because you also don't know what's going to happen with wearables. So if you're on the fringe, I think you have a lot of different characteristics that are about to come that could change your luck quickly. But if you have a donkey, which we'll probably have to do some video on how to assess how bad your horse is, those ones, yeah, stop racing them.
G, I got a question for you related to something you just mentioned, the profitability of horses in the entire system. I'm not putting you on the spot, but that roughly 70% that aren't making money, right? That's what you said. Have you guys,
the last stats? Yeah.
have you done anything with splitting that up by surface to see if there's any difference?
No, I kind of looked at the profitability, and it's one of those areas that I'm really not sure whether to build into a tool or not, because I actually don't want people to look at the profitability and go, oh, that's really awful, because they can give up too early. So
Yeah.
So the whole idea goes, I don't know, I've been looking at it, trying to understand between our weighted ratios and the industry ratios to profitability. But en masse, no, I haven't broken down that profitability. I haven't broken down the profitability by surface. What I can say though is, I was pouring through the data last night, and there are so many horses that have great potential that are not being run. So it's almost criminal right now. You look at some of the indisputable rates and the win ratios, and they've got like 3 starts. Like, what are you doing? You need to run those horses.
Yep.
It's painful sometimes to see that. And like, I see these horses that get thrown up there and just they have 10 races, and it's just like somebody gave up on a horse that quickly, and it's just it's sad. People need to run more. One thing I've noticed though is so many people seem to be afraid of the higher Dirk value. I swear 3 Dirk is a little bit easier. I don't touch 1 Dirk. I hate touching 1 Dirk because I feel like every time it's a 1 Dirk Monday, that's my lowest profitability. So I think that when you get higher up, you're getting just a tighter group of people that are racing, and then you have a better chance. Whereas like on the 1 Dirk, you have everybody and their brother racing, and you never know when somebody's going to throw in just a surprise world record. And to me, that's too risky.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to move on to the next one. We've mentioned a few different things here already, talking about different metrics that we've looked at. The data is already starting to be sifted into different areas and focuses. I want to know, this is a fairly easy question. How about I start with you, G? What's your favorite metric when you think about assessing a horse, in particular, a horse that you're still kind of working through discovery on?
See, it's really hard. I come back to the weighted win ratio. So I look at the actual, how much is the horse won, and I love the indisputable ratio because it's got a different view. But when it comes to my favorite, I go weighted win ratio, which talks to the ratio of how much the horse has actually won, how much of the winnings the horse has taken home. at the end of the day, we're looking at, is the horse making me money? Is the horse generating income and revenue that I can invest into more horses to grow those next horses? So that's where I start. But I quickly go the weighted win ratio, which is basically your indisputable ratio, but not based upon times.
Mm-hmm.
First, the number of seconds and the number of thirds, as opposed to the number of average times that would get you first, the number of average times that would get you second, or the number of times that would get you third. So I go, that's the golden ratio for me. It's not perfect, but it kind of balances out.
Yeah. All right. How about you, Vampire?
Yeah. So like before this call, we were just talking about how just extensive research. I swore in the beginning of all the research that macro data or the bigger averages was never going to be good enough, and that you have to zoom into the micro data. And the more and more I do this, the more I just get so obsessed with the linear regression model that we recently talked about. I find it to be extremely reliable. And like I can share my screen briefly here. Let me turn this thing on. Is like, so in this model, not digging into it, but what you will see over and over again, I've been intentionally hitting tracks where I normally wouldn't be hitting as much. And as I try to raise up my values, if I see a spike, meaning time is all of a sudden no longer on this linear path and it's slower, or if it's really fast, I've found that if I keep hitting that track more and more and more, it's going to pull itself to that flat line. And I'm seeing it to be consistent. And when I see other people like on a racing club that are having horses where they have bad data sets, I've asked them to hit tracks more. And when they hit it, we're finding it getting tighter and tighter. And as you look at these numbers, they are all so similar across the board. And these are those three phases. And like what you could do very easily is, let me switch back over to Scondert here because he has the most data that I could find, is that when you take a look at this and you look at your average furlong from left to right, it should consistently drop each value. And then when you go vertically, it should also drop as it does. And then so what I do over and over and over again is, while I'm looking for my tracks, is if I see it go from 168 to all of a sudden 175 and then down to 12.4, I would think that this one here is the incorrect data set. So as soon as I realize that that's no longer within that range, those are the areas I target. And then what I do is I just do it enough to see if I could start pulling it down. It does not mean that I have a champion. My secondary one that I would look at is going to be my indisputable score, because I like looking at time trials, because I know that so many races don't fill, especially in the 2 and 3 Dirk. So you can have disproportionate win rates. I do like the win rates as well, but I'm a fan of looking at the performance of the horse. So I use linear regression as my compass. And then from there, I like to look at my indisputable to justify whether or not I should hit those numbers hard.
How many horses did you guys go through discovery with before, well, let's even say today, before you had a chance to really understand the weighted win rate or the indisputable score? I know you guys have had that for weeks, months even at this point. But how long did it take you before you realized that, oh, that actually might be key?
It was early on. Well, it was really early on that we went the weighted win rate, because we weren't looking at averages then. We were actually just focusing on which horse is winning. And so that was the golden rule. So which horse do I have that's actually beating other horses? So it wasn't even the process of going through discovery. It was more the process of just running the analytics and using the weightings from DeRace. DeRace has the 0.5 of the pool gets first, 0.3 gets second, and 0.15 gets third. And those are magic numbers when you actually start to analyze how much winnings is the horse bringing back, or applying it to the indisputable to get a weighted approach. So it was early on. And so from there, we've built out, from weighted win to, I've tried a number of the metrics that make no sense and that didn't actually go anywhere. Let's be honest about that one. But from there we went to, I really like the indisputable, and then I've also built out a probability model. So that really tries to, I've gone from actuals to theoretical and to modeling. So the further I get away, the further it's more theoretical, but it opens up different possibilities. So the probability model is based upon the horse's averages and their standard deviations in their time. So trying to build that normal distribution curve and actually use that to model what the horse should be doing, as opposed to what the horse is doing. And that's the one I'm trying to shortcut on assessments. It's not there yet. it has its own faults, but so does win rate and so does indisputable. So we're all looking at 3 different models. So I'm trying to bring them together like a basket of metrics right now. So that's where my head is.
That's good stuff.
The fact that you bring up, and so going back, I think the first time I met you, you talked about standard deviations, and that's like my favorite thing. So I absolutely love standard deviation. And when you have normal distribution, that standard deviation to me tells everything. And so early in, when I was studying these things, I was trying to find how can I get an understanding of that normal distribution curve, and then trying to figure out how many races are required for that normal distribution to become balanced. And so I one of my frustrations with low performing people without getting the race counts up is you don't ever really get that bell curve. And so I wanted to make sure that I hit it as much as I can so I could see that. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that it's 100+ races before you really see that thing level out. But then what I was used to do too is once I thought I had a normal distribution curve, I would count the lower limits and the upper limits, and I would count how many standard deviations the way it was, and knowing that it's around 34% for the lower limit one, and then down to 12 to 15%, and then down to about 2%. I like to use that to calculate probability, but that's really hard to do. So rolling your average speed, I like to figure out your trail from where you are from your first, second, and third, and then to figure out how many standard deviations away you are to be able to calculate that probability. On paper, it sounds so good, but it's really, really hard to predict. So like, yeah, I constantly like to assess those things. Those were my favorite areas originally, but man, I just keep going down in the weeds. And sometimes I think I have it, and then I just feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And I just go back, just brute force and just let my brain cool off.
I'm clinging on to the idea that this entire game is actually built around standard curves. The problem we have is anyone who doesn't race their horse enough just gives up, just goes, you know what? So you don't have a lot of that bad data. So where I look at what the averages are today, well, the averages are not actually average. The averages are actually skewed to the higher end and to the faster horses because that's the only people that are running them in the particular races.
That's correct.
Yeah. So you actually have to you have to account for the fact that people aren't running the donkeys and you're not getting the standard distribution curve, and apply your models accordingly because it doesn't actually work given the data sets we have.
I hate that I agree with you on that one.
I was actually just going to say one of my kind of question not on our prepared list that I was going to hit you guys with is asking what you think wearables, class separation or levels with horses, what's that going to do to someone like you guys who's love to sit back and look at the data? Do you suspect you're going to need to split out pre and post wearables? What do you think you're going to do to prepare for that change?
Let's see. Do you want to take this one, G, or you want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay. All right. I honestly, I'm excited for it. So rewinding back a little bit to reaction, because we know that it's from 150 to 800. I could tell you with 3,000+ races that Skondert is 150 to 400. So he doesn't go slower than that ever. What I'm hoping, really hoping, is that wearables are going to help us trim the variance that we see. Really hoping for this. Like when we have jockeys that bond, I'm really curious to see if the normal distribution curve, if it starts to get pulled in from the backside and we start to see it leaning a little bit forward facing to as in faster. I'm hoping that's the case, but when it comes to data, I'm terrified that is going to be something that we're going to have to analyze, and I'm not anticipating switching anything. So I have a feeling that once I put a jockey on Skondert and once I put any items on Skondert, I'm not going to flip-flop those things until I probably reset at least 30+ races, because I'm going to have to assess that. And then a common thing in troubleshooting anything in life, you should only change one thing at a time. So if you have a horse that has an average pace of, let's say, a 12.2 furlong, and then you decide to put 3 different new things on, and then all of a sudden drops to a 12.10, well, what if it would have been a 12.5 with one of those things? And so I think it's critical that as you start to do this, you do it slowly, and then you do it and you lock it. You make sure you get a baseline data, and you shouldn't, in my opinion, you shouldn't do a multiple tracks. I'm going to probably really focus on one track at a time as I test out my wearables, as I test out my jockeys, to try to get a better sense of that. Because otherwise, I think you're going to have way too many variables that you're going to have no way of understanding whether it's a benefit or a curse.
But you realize that everybody's just going to look to your tool to understand what their wearable actually does to their horse. So they're just going to throw every wearable that they have at a horse at the same time and just go, right, I'm just going to use a tool, and that'll tell me later on whether or not it actually gets the right result. I'm really excited. Yes, it's gonna throw a whole bunch of models out, and we're going to try to figure out, before and after. But the bottom line is, I think this adds so many possibilities. I don't know that I'm expecting variance to shift, but maybe the minimums and maximums may shift. Just pouring through again all the data last night, there are so many things that just are consistent through the entire ecosystem. So you look at, I was trying to pull apart, good example. I was trying to pull apart speed last night. So trying to figure out the right way to actually create a metric that represents a horse speed across the 3 different types of surfaces. And you start looking at standard deviations on split times, on roll times. So on every single roll, what's every horse's standard deviation? Well, the standard deviation is 66 milliseconds. So like for every horse on every surface. Okay. So then you start, well, so that's basically fixed. There's a point around that really doesn't seem to be shifting. So you're just going to figure out what will actually move and what won't move. And I think, and what I'm expecting is the minimums and maximums to move and within the range. Again, I'm trying to think like the game designer. What would you actually do? Yeah, and I think the interview that you did with Christus, great, great interview, but very much talking about the fact that you can potentially add 1 or 2 points to your stamina, 2.3 points to your speed, and you could really potentially draw from one to the other, which adds in a whole level of complexity. But the point is, he's talking about it in point terms. So, okay, cool. They're on a point system. So they're going, speed is maybe rated out of 20 or rated out of 100. And so we can actually start to model that as not increasing your average speed, but increasing an underlying metric, which flows through to your speed, which flows through to your win rate. So we're kind of, the metrics we have early on are 2 or 3 steps away from actually how they show up as a horse result. And I think that makes it interesting because you can model that far easier, and we'll get to breeding in a second, I'm sure. But that plus or minus 5% adds in all sorts of variables, and what's that plus or minus 5% built on? My point being, wearables add opportunity, and I don't know that we're going to I don't know it's going to shrink down the variance, but I think it might just shift the averages by actually making more parts of the scale available to the horse, if that makes sense. The horse will run between 0 and 10 or 0 and 15 with a wearable kind of thing.
So what I wonder on this one is, because I try to think of it as if I was designing this game, and one of the biggest criticism I have about watching this and compare it to real life is how far apart that the horses will. There's less and less of this bundle, whereas we see more in real life. So what I was wondering about is, if I was a jockey, my job as a jockey is to make sure that the horse is maintaining the aggression and that push. And so if my horse was slowing down, I could yaw on it a bunch more to try to get it go faster. So rather than thinking that a jockey is going to raise my top speed by 2 points, I'm wondering if there is a bottom point that we lift. And so I'm curious if we're not necessarily going to see by roll analysis, which I love that, because I did the same, looking at the standard deviation of each of those. I'm curious if we're going to see that the bottom half is going to lift up. And by lifting up the bottom half, your overall speed's going to improve. Your horse isn't going to be necessarily faster when you talk about kilometers per hour or miles per hour, but it's going to be faster when you talk about time per furlong. So I'm curious to see if we notice that. I think that would be a great feature of the game, because I think we'd start to see tighter bundles, but we never got a chance to ask Christie's that, because we would have been fixated so much on what is this speed score, what is this reaction score, and what is the stamina score. But I am curious if there's a second layer of those metrics.
Something that you mentioned there, G, was the 66 millisecond standard deviation. That's something that I've actually noticed as well. There is obviously variation in some, especially when horses don't have enough races, but there seems to be a very tight range that they sit in, plus or minus. And one thing that I've found in my own studies for creating a speed metric of some sort is aligning very much with what I'm hearing you say with regard to kind of focusing on the middle of the track, middle of the races, looking at your averages across that entire span. that's what I've focused on as well. So hearing that you're focusing there as well was really interesting. But one thing that I've found, and I don't know if you've found this as you've been attempting to create a model, I'm actually seeing that speed and any score that we assign to it doesn't seem to have a ton of variance in the Gen 0 to Gen 1 range. And when Christus mentioned that we might only be a few generations away from seeing the best or the worst, that actually got me thinking that these tight scores are actually a good thing, because we're not going to see that a few generations later you've got a horse that's 15 seconds behind everyone else. It's that it's going to be so close that within the noise of that standard deviation you could still potentially throw a really good time and lead the pack, even though you might be a donkey.
Yeah, I think I'm exactly where you are at the moment. So when I was pulling apart those stats, so we know that every roll, so in the middle phase of the race, that 15 to 70% mark, every roll is between 1050 and 1550 milliseconds. Okay, but then you look at the averages and you're right, like there's just fractions of seconds between them. And when you start talking averages, but if you think about the fact that a 12 furlong race has 120 rolls, that's 120 opportunities to be 6 milliseconds out. Do the easy math and go, okay, well, let's just say it's 100 rolls, do 10 furlongs, 6 milliseconds out, that's 600 milliseconds out. It's over half a second behind. So on average, so you can, but those very, very small deviations on average per roll add up to a very large difference at the end. So as much as I'm looking at the speed metrics thinking these are so tightly clustered together, when you extrapolate them out over the course of the race, they start to become material. They start to easily change the results. So I'm not sure what to do with the 66 millisecond standard deviation yet, by the way. I'm still looking at it, because that's at a per horse level, it holds up. But at a race level, sometimes sometimes a horse will run a race with 34 millisecond standard deviation, or 48 millisecond standard deviation. So I'm trying to figure out whether or not there's a randomness, or whether there's a structure to how to the horse's standard deviation. What is the probability? What is the distribution curve for distribution curves?
Yep. That's exactly right. That's the way I look at it. Now, we've talked obviously a lot about a handful of different metrics here, and some that I didn't even prep you guys for asking questions, but I want to swing over really quick into talking about breeding. And I'm actually going to start with you, Not a Vampire, and I want to know, when you think about what you're looking for in pairing a couple of horses for a potential breed, what are you looking for? Let me just ask that. What are you looking for?
Okay. So based off of what we know, when we spoke with Christie's, let me turn that off, is that the parents, are you going to take that range? So if you have a parent that has a speed score of, let's say, an arbitrary number of 80, and then the other one is a 60, that range, it's going to fall anywhere within that range, plus or minus that 5%. So that's what we've learned. And so for me, what I'm looking for is, I mean, all I want to do is to make a better version of Skondard. So I'm looking for horses that run very similar to the tracks that he likes, and that have very similar reactions. Reaction seems to be the easiest thing to identify. So if I know that my average is a 270 millisecond, I want to find a mare that's around the same. If it's slower than that, I don't want to chance it, because I don't want to end up finding out that I'm going to get the slow reaction, the long cool down. So first and foremost, I need to make sure that the reaction is within that period of space. I'm also very particular. I really want to have a beta, so I'm only doing that because I want to keep it in that class. But then the second thing I'm looking for is a horse that is showing up on turf. So my predominant focus is on turf 8s, 9s, and now all of a sudden 14s and 15s. So if I could find another horse that has similar tracks on those, I have to assume that they have similar speed scores, or at least not that wide of a gap. So if Skondard's an 80, if I could find a horse that maybe is 75, I feel like that's a safer risk for me to marry the two and put them out. Whereas like with Burra, and we've bred those two multiple times, where I think I was hoping I would be able to get Burra's dirt scores and Sconnert's turf scores, and then we'd just get a super full on all of those. But I don't know if that's possible any longer now that we've learned what we have. So my position is shifting a little bit, and I'm looking for someone that's going to be as close to my stallion that I want.
Before I ask any additional questions, G, why don't you tell us what you look for if you're considering pairing up horses?
I come from a really similar perspective, but I think where I start is what's the risk appetite. So I do believe you can get the best of both horses. However, I think the stats just say it might be a 5%. Then let's just call it a very, very small probability that you get the best of both, and then it's a super foal. So if what you're trying to do is actually minimize your risk, I look for horses that are actually that have similar reaction times or better reaction times than the horse that I'm trying to breed, sorry, and then look for something that keep dirt with dirt, keep synth with synth, and actually minimize my risk, because I've got a much higher probability, a very good probability, at least getting a decent horse if I can match the actual horse that I've got at the moment. However, the plus or minus 5%, again, I come back to plus or minus 5% on what? Again, it's the underlying metric, which then flows through to time, or it flows through to times, which then flows through to the win rate. So trying to model out what that plus or minus 5% looks like. We're not operating in the dark, pretty close to it, but the models have to evolve a little bit more before we can actually model out what that really looks like. So yeah, I go for similar horses.
Can I throw something else after that?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you guys believe that there's a strong chance that the foal will end up with the same preference of surface if they both parents are strong? So let's say it's two dirt horses. Do you believe that'll carry over more strongly, or do you actually consider what Chris just mentioned, where there is some adjustment or modification of the speed score per surface depending on what the other ones have? So he said that you look at an individual surface, let's say it's dirt, and they roll and they give you the plus or minus up to 5% between the ranges of the parents. And let's say that's a really bad one. So dirt was a bad score. There's actually a modifier, it sounds like, to the other surfaces. Synthetic or turf suddenly get a little bit extra, and you might end up with a slightly better synthetic horse than a dirt horse out of that full. So if that's the case, how do we look at something like two dirt horses and say, well, I feel confident that it's going to end up being dirt? Or do we just throw that out the window and say it's still just total chance?
I think it's total chance, but I think the odds of your chance are more favorable when the two parents are similar on that surface type. Like I think if we talk about like the super full concept of the best traits on all three surfaces, I suspect it's more like a 1% or a 0.5%. Having the best reaction, the best one turf or one surface, and best stamina of the parents on one track, I think is around 5%. So the reason why I say that with high levels of confidence is because I've bred plenty of donkeys and I've ran them to 200, 300 dirt in the hole to test out their data sets. And I hear a lot of people out there where they'll say like, hey, I got this super full, but then you look at one of the parents and the parent has like 200 races. And it's just like, how do you know you're better than that parent? That parent's barely been touched. So when we go back to the previous topic and that 60 millisecond standard deviation, I think there's so much noise that it's really difficult to assess whether or not the foal is actually better than those parents. And with that level of noise, I think it could filter it out pretty easily. So I think that you got to get a lot of testing with both those parents before you'll be able to even determine if that's even possible. But I think it's like, again, 5%.
I've seen two good horses on dirt breed and produce a pretty awful foal. So and I wasn't looking at the time. I wasn't looking for the synthetic, or looking for potentially a boost on turf. But I think it's a consolation prize. That's not what you're aiming for. It's a nice that maybe get a nice little bump in something else because you've really downgraded in the range on what you're actually aiming for. So I'd go similar. I'd pick horses with similar strengths. Minimize your probability of a poor result.
And every single two that I put together that have good reaction have led to a good reaction. So having that trait, that has carried over extremely well. The only time I've ever had a bad reaction on full is when I mixed in one with a large range. So that has been consistent in my research.
That's really interesting. I think going back to we've definitely bred Skondert and Burra, I think four times now,
Mm-hmm.
and they're something that we've come to learn as we've created our own internal metrics on scoring, speed, and reaction against the entire field, and working on stamina still. That's something we'll get to here shortly. But as we've looked to create our own metrics, Skondert is just gosh awful at dirt. And that doesn't mean that he can't win there, but comparatively his scores are so low, and then he can actually run synthetic and turf really well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Burra is kind of the opposite. Burra is pretty good on all three. And that translates to what I think is actually kind of a level of chaos when you go to breed with her, because you literally don't have any idea if it's going to be like +1, -1, +1 across all three surfaces, and then you end up with like a neutral gain in the speed score, and now you're
Mm-hmm.
reliant on your stamina score going up by 5%. And to be quite honest, I have to believe that stamina largely is just going to tell me where on the field I'm going to be good, or distance wise. It's not as much of a factor on whether or not I can get to that top speed fast enough to be good for consistency necessarily. Did you guys have anything to add to that, or should
I mean, yeah, no, I agree with that one. Nothing more to add. I mean, once I breed a superior foal, I'll be able to tell you a lot more. But at the time being, the only thing that I have been able to confirm is that reaction, in making sure that as long as they are tight together there, it passes on. So I'm still hunting to find a horse that I think has enough similar or tight enough range as Skondert to be able to see if I could pass that on. But yeah, time will tell.
So I was just going to say my only thoughts there would be, sorry, we end up raising the question, what is a good horse?
Mhm.
How many different races does a horse have to be for us to be great at, for us to classify a good horse? If I had a horse that just dominated 2 different races, I'd be really happy. I just run it as those 2 races all day, every day. And hopefully it's probably going to be a dirt race, because we know that dirt races occur 50% more than synthetic and turf races. So you look at the actual number of dirt races per day, it's just 50% high. I'll take that. If I've got a strong horse there, just run the numbers, run the math.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to that a little bit, how would you guys determine that you're able to assess a foal? Like how many races do you say the parents need to have and the foal needs to have before you can say, yeah, I gained or I lost in this?
If I'm going to breed somebody with Skondert, I want to see at least 100 races on the tracks that I feel confident in. Because like on mine, I'm looking at some of my stats. I have 518 on turf 8s. So when I look at his furlongs of 12, 2, 3, 7, 2, I'm pretty confident those are accurate. So if somebody shows up and goes, hey, my horse is really good at this one, I'm around the same numbers and they have 30 races, I'm not going to chance my cool down with that. Like, show me 100, and then we can start talking.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more forgiving, because show me 30 and I might be, and I'm absolutely considering it, depending upon what those numbers are. If the numbers are very high and they're looking very profitable, then I'll take my chance at 30 plus. Less than that, I'm just gonna assume that it's basically an unraced horse.
Yep.
How many breeding sessions have you been a part of, or your team's been a part of, that you've been able to directly assess?
You know what? Not that many. So I actually haven't bred my horses too much. I was actually really focused on building, not breeding. So I was trying to write and build all the tools, and that's where my head's been built. But my team's gone through. Oh, listen, I've been watching probably about 10, and that's why I've started building out a whole set of breeding tools so my team can actually assess. They can drop in numbers for the 2 different horses, and they can actually look at some sort of probability as to where the horse is likely to end up, or the minimums and maximums on those horses, and also just run parent analysis. So give me a horse and actually look at what those parents were like, and then compare it with the current status of the foal. So I'm at the moment, I've just trying to sit back and take in a lot of the data and look for the models and trying to look at the relationship between the parents and the foals. So yeah, about 10. Not a huge number, not enough for me to feel confident that I've got a statistically meaningful set of data.
So something that Not a Vampire and I did fairly early, and we still argue. So I'm gonna put this on Not a Vampire a little bit. Was looking at when you bred a foal, whether or not you could identify its value by the number of tracks in particular that it outpaced both of its parents. And that was how we looked at it initially, as well, let's just see, like, does it on average run faster than both sets of parents?
Yes.
Or just one set of parent on a certain surface? And I always struggle with that, because I was of the mindset, like, hey, if it just beats them on one, we're good. We've got a super full on that one track. But Vamp was always like, no, it's got to be 4, 5, 6, 7 tracks for it to be considered a success on the breeding side of things. So I'm putting him on the spot here, kind of bringing that to attention. But G, I'm curious your thoughts on that, and then I'll let Vamp respond.
Yeah, I wish I had a better response. I'm not sure, because I do understand it. So just when you're looking at your tools and you're doing your assessment, do you use the foal's top speeds on tracks or their average speeds on tracks?
I do both. So what I like to do, and like as Mr. E said, exactly right. Like if I'm breeding a horse, I want my Gen 1s to retire my Gen 0s. I like if they don't fully retire, I'd like to keep running them, of course, as best as I can. But if that Gen 1 cannot just put to shame their parents, then what's the point? And so as I look to this game, and I suspect that we're going to have Gen 1s competing against Gen 1s and 2s against 2s and 3s against 3s, what is the point of evolving to the next tier unless you have absolute confidence you have superior genetics? And so as I'm throwing in my liquid loves and my dirks and my training times on this one, if that Gen 1 is not superior, I have zero desire to ever breed that Gen 1 to make my Gen 2. So as I'm assessing them, I want to know, does your all-time top speed, which I could be a little bit more forgiving on that one, because that might take 60 hits before you get to there. But while it's maintaining its discovery, I want to see an average pace faster than both parents on a few tracks. So if I only have a foal that can beat the parents on one single track, to me, it fell short. It either does not have enough stamina, because I think that if it has the reaction, if it has the speed, and it has stamina, and all of those are better, why can't it outperform its parents on more than one track? And so if it's only showing up on one track where the parents can show up on 4 or 5, to me, that's a sign that something did not carry over to the way that I wanted to. And for me, I'm really strict when it comes to discovering on Gen 0s, but with foals and Gen 1s, I think those are easy. I think you could quickly assess them vertically and horizontally on the linear regression. And if they're not showing up after a couple bits of data, I think it's a strong indication that you don't have a better foal. And so I think Gen 1s are going to be burned aggressively, or at least that's what I'm planning on doing.
I agree.
Gee, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Do you believe that there is if you get a foal that has, let's say, just a positive stamina increase, so speed stays the same, surface stays the same, reaction stays the same, but it gets just a stamina increase, would you see it beat the parents on the same tracks or not?
On the same tracks.
On the same distance, same track.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
The reason I don't think so is I think that you look at we know that from everything that I know, everything that I understand, the last 30% of the race comes down to stamina and how much stamina the horse has left.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming the parents had adequate stamina on the races that they liked in order to win at those lengths, it means they had adequate stamina for the last 30% of the race to be competitive. If the foal you've bred has more stamina on the same races, and all three, and both parents and the foal all have sufficient stamina in order to be competitive in the last 30%, and no other variables have changed, I'd expect to see consistent. I do not think the foal would be better or worse than those horses, after a large enough number of runs.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Van?
I think I'm going to slightly disagree. I mean, though I do absolutely agree that the last 30% is where it's going to be the most indicated that the stamina exists or is strong. But when we talk with Christie's, he mentioned that there's elements to the lead up to the final 30 that consume stamina. So maybe it's jostling, maybe it's overtaking or catching or closing that first place. Maybe it has something to do with getting out of those first 15 rolls. Not enough research there for it, but I'm wondering if I had 100% stamina and my parents were the same speed, but they were at 90. I have a hard time thinking that I would not still be able to perform where they perform. If I was to get the exact same reaction and the exact same speed, but then I got a bump in stamina, I suspect that just means I'm going to show up on more tracks than the parents. I think if I had less, I'm going to show up in less.
So this gets to something that I'm curious on both of you, and I think Not a Vampire just mentioned it here, is when we think about the angle downward, right, on any particular horse. So coming into that last 30% as you're speeding up, and you're going to reach your top speed for whatever that particular track is. The question is, can you reach your top speed faster or slower? I suspect that is a stamina element. Whether you get there and still have enough in the tank to basically coast to your top speed and then hold it, because it seems to flatline as you come at the end. There's not really a pull up. So the idea to me is that angle down, whatever that is, whatever that ratio or slope is, I suspect that the faster you get there, the more stamina you actually had. If you have less, they have to pace it out over the same remaining distance. You don't get to there as quick. That's my theory. What I believe, I'm actually going to disagree with Vamp here.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that results in a foal that has the same thing as the parents, except for a stamina change. I would suspect that they're going to be better on longer distances. So if the parent was good on, turf 10s, 11s, 12s, the foal may be good on 12s, 13s, 14s. And that they have the same exact speed score. They reach that same average in their midsection, and they can get to their top speed, but they get to it either quicker or slower, and that's something we're still studying. But I would suggest they're slightly different.
So where I struggle, and this is one of the things that we argue about frequently, I'm not convinced there's not a pull-up, because here, following the linear regression model, I've been aggressively getting my numbers up on synthetic 11s, and I've been aggressively attacking my turf 15s. And as you notice here, I got 94 and 150 race experience. Let me zoom down so these horses are out of the way. 12, 1901 on 14s, 12, 1947 on 15s. 150 and 94, I would assume, is trustworthy data. So I am slowing down on 15s. When I come over here to my synth 10s and 11s, I got, again, 12, 24, 37, and I slow down to 12, 31, 69, 113 to 50 races. So yeah, it's not an enormous amount of data, and I'm still aggressively targeting those, but I'm not convinced. Like, I'm wondering that as I get those numbers up higher, I would like to get closer to 100 on all four. I would like to zoom in and start assessing very closely the final 30% on 14s and 15s and the final 30% on 10s and 11s. And I want to see the differences of my reaction on those tracks to see if, like, is there any kind of evidence that maybe my stamina burns differently on those two, but I am seeing the slowdown, which goes against that concept. So, like, I suspect there is going to be an indication there that we're going to be able to see that burn off.
Any other thoughts on that, guys?
Just thinking through, because I know that we initially, Vamp, we initially talked through the different phases,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not convinced anymore that the last 30% is a single phase. So I'm really rethinking that structure, whether or not it's, whether it's 70 to 90, and then the last 10% is actually different again, because the minimums and maximum speeds in those roles shift. So I know that across the middle, I can say it's 1050 to 1550, right? Okay, but when you get to the end, it actually shifts at the 90% mark again. It's only a slight change, but it's enough for me to think, oh, it's interesting. Interesting. I need to look further into it. So I'm trying to figure out whether or not the last 10% of the race is actually a slight shift as well, which would not make a lot of difference in a low furlong race.
Yeah,
but makes a lot of difference as soon as you get sort of that 12 furlongs and higher.
Yeah,
I would tease you to look at that in relation to the horses that end up first place and or second and third, not horses across the board, because I have a similar thing that I'm seeing in the pull up at the very end, where it's like some of these horses that consistently run really well on their best tracks will actually slow up a little bit. And I suspect that it is they jumped out into first place, it slows them down a little bit while the others catch up, and that is actually affecting their averages, even though across the board they're fast in those last potential few rolls. There seems to be a variance. I'd never actually thought of it as a separate phase, but that is really interesting.
And I think one of the things we're going to have to test is to not only do the detailed furlong analysis, the roll by rolls, but I think we're going to also have to start to assess those based off of the horse's performance, where they podiumed, because I am really curious to see when I've won first place, second place, and third place, do I accelerate all the way to the end? Did something happen in the race that I jostled too much at the beginning that I burned out? So like I think that that's going to be the place where we could discover where stamina is. And I think it was brilliant by design that they made it 7, 11, and 15, because this makes it really hard to reverse engineer this part.
Very good. Well, that actually leads me to something that people who are listening or watching might be asking, and that is, I want to buy a horse. I'm curious what you guys think I should be paying attention to. How do I rate the horses that are out there and available for me to purchase?
Do you want to start,
That's a really hard question. Again, okay, so the number of factors, and if somebody who hasn't done a lot of work in this space and actually is coming at it pretty cold, it's basically Schrodinger's horse, right? Yeah, it's a good foal and it's a bad foal at the same time. Until you race it, you have no idea. But at the moment, where I would start again, if it's Gen 0 and it's unraced, yeah, and sorry. Does it have parents? Does it not have parents? Can you use the parents' information to determine where it's likely? And we get back to the parent and the breeding conversation. This is, what horse do I buy is very similar to the breeding conversation. Is the horse tested? Is it proven or is it unproven? Do we have data to back it up? Do we have parental data to back it up? Because again, you can actually look at things like indisputable rates and weight to win ratios and quickly convert those to yield or ROI statistics. So I guess I can't really tell anybody else to do anything more than look at the parents or look at the horse's existing data, if there is existing data. And the reality is, if it's completely untested, if it's Gen 0 and it's got no it's got no data against it, I'd buy it. Like it's that cool.
I mean, first of all, I would have to say, like, if somebody out there does not own a horse and they've watched this video this far, they are bigger nerds than us. So I would like to meet you someday. The second thing is that also, if you're new and you are not as familiar with this, they did an algorithm change. What was it, in February? Wherever that was. But if you see horses on the market that have not been raced after March, that's basically an unraced horse. And so when you get onto open seas, and yes, don't look at the floor. The floor is so garbage for the most part. The first thing I would do, if you're even considering a horse that's been tested, throw it into one of these tools, find out what the reaction is. If the reaction is absolutely garbage, yeah, you're already starting on an uphill battle. So I might not consider that as much. If it is a Gen 1, I think it's an excellent call. Look at the parents. Even if the foal is not as good as the parents, it doesn't mean that it's not a good horse. It might mean that the parents are just so good that the owner of them just doesn't want to race a horse that's inferior to it, but it could be a good horse. So taking a look at the parents can give you an assessment of its potential. And people like myself, if you have a foal that's not delivering the same way, you might not race it as much. So there might still be some untapped potential. But I highly would recommend, if it's a Gen 0, there's perks to it. I would definitely look at the last race data. If it's anything before that March period of time, assume it's empty. And when I look at empty horses, I think it's a pretty good sign. I kind of prefer buying the unraced ones just to explore. I think it's kind of fun and frustrating, but you never know if there's a diamond in the rough. And like, G, you said it really well. Right now, all the data is based off of the people that are really aggressively racing their horses. I think Sconnert's great, but all I know, Sconnert might be like a top 20% horse compared to like the top 5% horse that he's delivering on right now. So we don't know how many horses out there that are untested are going to really show up and crush it. So to prop the tools real quick, I'm going to share this once more to make sure that people that are watching understand what is available and things to look for. So when I turn this thing on, here we go. Just make sure that like when you punch in a horse ID, like I'm going to take 5762, this horse is for sale. So when I open up this horse on these tools, you can see right here, the profit right now, it's only down 18 dirt. So it is tested somewhat, not a ton. That's not bad. And so we were talking about the beginning, you could claw your way into profitability. The testing isn't fully thorough. The reaction is very good.
Yeah, very good reaction.
So those are the things I would look for. This is appealing to me. And then the second one, when I look at that linear regression model, you go through this thing. I like to see like, okay, is this horse showing these good signs? That looks right. When you take the 12.28, that means that this one should be faster. And then down here, 12.2, these are pretty good speeds. So when you're looking through these horses, take a look at these numbers and try to look down the line and see if there's some untapped potential. But there's not a ton of experience on this horse. So things like this, I would see as an opportunity. If you see somebody has genuinely raced their horse a ton and it is just slow across the board, stay away. If the reaction is just garbage, yeah, and it's in the hole, then I would highly recommend staying away unless it's incredibly cheap and you're just planning on incinerating it and turning it to sugar. So
yeah, I think the one thing I would add there is just to reiterate something you just said is very much. I know you talked about whether the horse is in the hole or not, whether it's got a positive ROI as a horse, as a holistic as a horse. I would ignore that. Because again, you can have a whole bunch of races that people have run that really they shouldn't have run in the first place. They may have had a bad owner, a bad trainer. They may not be running the right races at the right time. They might be complete scattergun. So focus in on a race by race set of profit per race. Look at the profit per race data. That's where my mind goes immediately to figure out whether or not it's something that looks viable.
I'm one of those really bad trainers. I think I have I don't know. I have something like 12 to 15 different horses right now, and they're mostly Gen Zeros. So I was really trying to understand them as potential breeding pairs. So I came at it from that perspective, and I have, oh my word, 700, 800 races on absolute donkeys. And they are garbage, but usually they'll have one track. But you know how long it takes to claw your profitability back when you're down 300 dirt and then you're winning one track, a couple times a day, and that's it. You're like, okay, I'll see you in 2023 here, and that's where I think you're absolutely right, G. Like being able to know if profitability is track specific and using the tools that are available now is going to be key. If you're looking to buy, like, don't worry about the PPR as a whole, or the profitability as a whole, I should say. But instead look at those individual tracks and see if there's any that you can target and have it actually just be, even if it's a slow climb toward profitability.
Yeah. Don't look at my horses. I've spent a lot of time. I've spent a lot of time racing them just for fun. So I know you reviewed a few of the tools that we've created in our SMR Discord, but one of the things we do is the Zippy bot actually reports on the races. And so one of the things that I built it to do was make fun of the horses that are actually having bad runs. So I run some of my donkeys just to see Zippy Bot actually just for a bit of fun, just to see the Zippy Bot actually make fun of the poor performance that the horses actually turn out on a whole bunch of tracks.
It's good stuff.
That I think that's a perfect note to start buttoning it up, because I want to say, first of all, man, thank you, G, for coming on the show and talking with us. I'd like to do this multiple more times. But also the people that are watching, just to replug. So G is one of the guys from SMR who handles the Discord bots, the Zippy stats, and he's given us access to the APIs, which we're using to give publicly. So without G and the people at SMR, we'd all be racing blind. So major thank you to you and all the work that you've done the past week. I know you've been putting a lot of extra time.
It's my pleasure. It's our pleasure. We're really trying. We know that a good community will be better for all of us. So the more tools the more builders we have, the more tools we have. It makes it more interesting, and everyone has a different perspective and a different lens. So we're happy to contribute.
Excellent.
Well, I want to say thank you to Not a Vampire and OxG for joining us today for our little stats chat here. This is something that we're probably going to want to do occasionally, deep dive into the statistical analysis and circle back around to this. So I'm sure we'll have G back on at some point, but I wanted to say thank you to both of you.
Of course, man.
Anytime.
All right, guys. Well, thank you all for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on the future video.